Excellent. Thanks, Dermot. So good afternoon. I guess we can say afternoon. It's noon on Tuesday, this 15th of February. I'm really excited to kick off the spring 2022 lecture series at School of Architecture and Planning. We're thrilled to welcome Jeremy Kargon, who is going to be our first lecturer this semester. He is an illustrative associate professor at Morgan. I was happy to have him when I started working here. Worked here for 13 years, was the director of the program for a while, and then left in summer of 2020 to kind of start again and restart practicing, and is working at CRGA Design in Baltimore, specializes in healthcare. Jeremy has a wealth of information on many different levels of architecture and history and theory, and I'm just really excited to have him back here at CBUS and virtually to give an exciting lecture. So welcome, Jeremy.
All right, well, thank you and good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank everyone for joining me for this presentation, especially those whose last name is not Kargon. That's great to see you. And of course, I want to thank the organizers of the SAP Spring Lecture Series for having me in. As Sarah just explained, this is a little bit like a homecoming for me. I left Morgan's faculty about 1.5 years ago, and although I've been back in CBUS a handful of times, mostly just to sort of pack up my gear, this is the first time since I've left that I've participated in an academic event hosted by the SAP. So my 13 years at Morgan were a productive and stimulating time for me, and I really miss my former colleagues and students. So anyway, I want to get started, but before I do, I feel I need to include this trigger warning. What follows is satiric and as such represents a critical perspective about its contents. So the target of this satire may not be immediately obvious. And that leads me to my second warning. You're going to have to sort of parse some of this. You're going to think about it. You, the audience, will have some work to do. Finally, like all former and present college professors, I think my own jokes are hilarious. So satire is supposed to be funny, but it's maybe a little dry. One question remains: can architectural design actually be funny? So answering that question will be on your final exam today. Well, let me start out with this example, the story of which begins in Italy. Architecture students in the audience should be familiar with the architect Giuseppe Cariani. His work includes the famous Casa del Fascio dating to 1936, which you see on the left. When people complain about fascist architecture, I guess they don't mean buildings built by actual fascists, because Cariani's work is certainly excellent. Although the bulk of his work is in Como, Italy, he designed a number of apartment buildings in Milan before his premature death in 1943. But one of Cariani's lesser known projects is this apartment house in Baltimore, Maryland. Designed in the late 1930s. Now, I call it lesser known probably because the events I'm about to describe didn't actually occur. Now, in my account, Cariani was a contemporary of local politician Tommy D'Alessandro Jr., whose Genoese grandmother was a family friend of the Carianis. So what happened was this: as a member of the Baltimore City Council, Tommy D was asked to fix a building permit for a local developer. Now, as the child of immigrants in Baltimore's notoriously nativist popular culture and political culture, D'Alessandro saw a chance to temper the city's political climate with a form of cultural exchange. He invited Giuseppe Cariani, Italy's premier modernist architect, to come to Baltimore to prepare plans for this project. Now, this project was called Home for Italo-American Veterans of the Great War, by which they meant the previous World War, not the soon-to-come World War. Local newspapers covered the project's groundbreaking on March 23rd, 1938, and they used these words, quote, "In his address to reporters at 3 West Lafayette Street, D'Alessandro explained that this building will commemorate the contributions of Americans of Italian descent to the security and to the defense of the United States." The journalist continued, when asked about its unusual design, Cariani asked that war veterans often forget where they are. And so to find their way home, they need only to remember the number 3. Well, things weren't all copacetic at the event. D'Alessandro's address was interrupted by a group of protesters, including political refugees from Mussolini's government. The protesters cited Cariani's family connection to the fascist party, as well as the architect's design for Mussolini's government. D'Alessandro and Cariani tried to calm down the crowd and together explain that Italians had long been friends of the United States and that the United States itself had given Italy many cultural gifts. And he cited Charlie Chaplin and corn as two examples. So Cariani examined that he opined that he hoped that his design for this building would contribute something in return. So what you see here is tame in comparison to Cariani's work in Italy, but it was a radical innovation for Baltimore's conservative architectural culture. And that radicalism may have partly caused its demise. The project was completed in mid-1939, but its opening was delayed by the outbreak of the European War that year. Evidently, Baltimore's downtown real estate market was unenthusiastic about a design so prominently branded as an Italian production. So once it was opened, it remained empty until until America entered the war in 1941, and afterwards it was disassembled for its valuable materials. So to this day, the lot remains empty and used as a parking lot. And just to wrap up this story, at the time, D'Alessandro realized that he had miscalculated, so he quickly disavowed the project. Fortunately for him, this one fiasco didn't affect his local political success, and some Baltimoreans may remember that he successfully ran for Congress the next year and returned to Baltimore in 1947, and was a popular multiple-term mayor of the city. As for the architect, Giuseppe Cariani, he was forced to return to Italy, where he was drafted and sent to the Russian front. That didn't go well for him. So here's my question. Actually, I'm going to ask somebody to mute themselves. There we go. Thank you. So here's my question. From today's perspective, what is the point of this story? What is the point of that design? As I explained at the start, the building never actually existed, nor did Cariani ever come to Baltimore. Obviously, the point of the story is embedded in this question. What if he had? For a long time, I've been fascinated with counterfactual history, a literary genre akin to historical fiction, with a few important differences. Obviously, all fiction is fiction and is accordingly counterfactual at a basic level. That said, most non-genre fiction operates within recognizable environments where events are more or less what we commonly perceive them to be. The same holds true for classic examples of historical fiction, even if their settings are slightly more exotic. Now, historical fiction recreates a past time with as much fidelity as is feasible, and it does so to illuminate or explain certain circumstances in the past. Of course, the result is also entertaining. It's fun to have ourselves projected as readers into other eras. But fidelity to the architectural record is important to readers of those books, and controversies erupt when mistakes are made or when accepted facts are ignored. Now, on the other hand, counterfactual histories are not supposed to be realistic. In contrast, they're supposed to be critical and even satiric. Now, generally, they're supposed to provide an image of the past that allow us to ask something different from ourselves in the present. Now, I think that's not so different than what architectural design does. After all, every new design intends to effect a change upon reality, to transform it from what it is to what could be. But over the last year and a half now that I've gotten back into professional practice, I find myself asking instead, what should be? Well, what should be is also what should have been. Now, with a stunning lack of creativity, I've been calling the world of what should have been as Alt Baltimore. It's a place in which I'd like to live, if only to benefit from the better social services, really great mass transit, and delightful walkability. It's also a place where I think the architecture is pretty cool for reasons that you may have already guessed. So here's another example, a story that begins around the same time Tommy D'Alessandro served in Alt Baltimore City Council. The mayor's race in 1935 was a very contentious one, with the popular Democratic incumbent Howard Jackson resigning very close to election day due to reports of an extramarital affair. Now, the remaining candidates were a Republican and a socialist candidate, Elizabeth Gilman. Gilman was surprisingly popular despite her platform in support of workers' rights, civil liberties, and racial equality, which were somewhat taboo positions in 1930s majority white Baltimore. But Gilman won anyway, becoming the first woman mayor of a major American city and the first prominent local politician to know all the words to the poem Bread and Roses. After taking office, Mayor Gilman declared that her administration would support in every possible way the makers and not the takers for their daily labor. As a symbol of her commitment, Mayor Gilman announced the establishment of new municipal departments to do so. Now, this building, the Ministry of Culture, was established to manage the production of the visual and performing arts within Alt Baltimore city lines. The Ministry of Culture's activities were primarily administrative, but its appointees were charged with incubating new artwork throughout the city. Accordingly, the building built to house the ministry included a public gallery and artist studio, along with offices for the new bureaucracy, the new arts bureaucracy. The most prominent feature of the Ministry of Culture was a grand staircase that you can see on the right in the top here. And this staircase allowed open and free access to the ministry's offices. The building also featured murals by prominent artists like Diego Rivera. Now, the mural seen on the lower left was titled "Man, Controller of the Universe," and had recently been rejected by the planners of Rockefeller Center, and instead was installed to great acclaim at the Ministry of Culture in Alt Baltimore. Now, actually, this is an incredible mural, and I wish I could take credit for this, but sometimes fiction is not fake. So, as for the building itself, of particular interest to contemporary alt historians is its architect, Julian Bell, Philadelphia-based designer, best known for his Duke University and its famous Gothic campus. Abel was charged by Mayor Gilman herself to show her constituents what newness meant in architecture. In response, Abel experimented with curtain wall technology and the spare, abstract massing of the exterior. Now, this design was, however, Abel's first and last experiment with modernism. There is some evidence that the architect's enthusiasm flagged over the course of the project's design, and he was said to have muttered to workmen during construction, "I miss my gargoyles." Furthermore, Abel's connection to the project ended prematurely due to disagreements with the ministry's supervisors over the building's interior decor. Against the architect's wishes, the walls were painted gold, red, black, and white. And as Abel told his biographer years later, the reason was, quote, "those Marylanders and their damn flag." Now, unfortunately for the Ministry of Culture, Mayor Gilman's administration lasted only 4 years. In 1939, after the start of the war in Europe, Alt Baltimore's political winds shifted away from those who supported, like Mayor Gilman, the Soviet Union's occupation of Poland. And in that year, as the election, Republican Theodore McKeldin beat Elizabeth Gilman by a substantial margin. And once in office, he dismantled the Ministry of Culture's activities. As for the building itself, later mayors didn't quite know what to do with it. And in the late 1950s, planners of Charles Center initially proposed to replace the building with a parking garage. I mean, it is Alt Baltimore. But a younger generation of Baltimoreans refused to let the building go. And after a celebrated public campaign to save the building was left intact. Of course, since that time, public support for art has garnered an ever-growing portion of the city's annual budget in Alt Baltimore. And so today, the former Ministry of Culture is now home to Baltimore's Office of Promotion and the Arts. As such, the Ministry of Culture remains the city's epicenter for new arts funding, development, and exhibition. And the interior walls still bear the color, the original color scheme, and the rooftop sign still reminds passersby of the building's original mission and of Mayor Elizabeth Gilman's long ago initiative for Alt Baltimore. Now, in comparison, our real Baltimore has a tendency to dream big and do little. And even when major public works are put into place, we real Baltimoreans are a bit fickle after the luster of novelty wears off. In the last decade, tearing stuff down has really taken the place of building stuff up, especially when the architectural style is neither quaint nor kitsch. On the other hand, as you might expect, Alt Baltimore has done a better job at preserving its modernist legacy. So here's another example. In 1945, architect Minoru Yamasaki moved to Alt Baltimore instead of to Detroit. So in the decades that followed, his career took a very different path than what we might remember. Yamasaki never built any skyscrapers. He never built the New York's Twin Towers. But a chance encounter with a chemist at Johns Hopkins led to a patent for fire-resisted laminated timber, so that Yamasaki, as you can see here, became the foremost proponent of the architectural application of glulam structures in the 1950s and 60s. In Alt Baltimore, Yamasaki deployed laminated timber to reconcile modernism with the Gothic style to which he had been exposed as a student out west at the University of Washington. To the question, why are so many modern buildings so boring? Yamasaki answered, "Not mine." This building, dated to the 1960s, is typical of Alt Baltimore's multi-story mixed-use apartment buildings, which totally replaced row houses after World War II. On the ground floor, a space was originally occupied by a store for women's hosiery, but since that time has been replaced by a kale-free juice bar. Everyone can rejoice. Now, when I posted this project on social media, more than one architect asked me, "Is this you or is this the real Yamasaki?" So I guess it's a compliment that folks who should know better really don't. Either way, it was with this project that I first had the idea for the architectural equivalent of Pseudepigrapha, which is an English word that comes from the Greek false inscription. And it means in English, of course, a spurious attribution, which is usually intentional. The word is usually used in other contexts, such as the history of Jewish religious texts, like the Sefer HaZohar. In fact, the practice is common among religious writers around the world. The thinking is that hard-to-read works of spiritual homilies might be better received if one attributes it to someone long dead, and of course, the deader, the better. Now, for instance, the book's title page that you can see here attributes its authorship to a 2nd century rabbi, Shimon ben Yochai, even though the actual author lived in Spain more than 1,000 years later. The publisher must have thought, hey, the text is in Aramaic, who's going to know the difference? Now, when you think of it, pseudepigrapha is akin to forgery, except that it doesn't pretend to replace a known object. Instead, it is itself the original, even if ascribed falsely to a venerable author. Of course, there have been plenty of examples in the fine arts, such as Rembrandt's famous dog playing poker, but it is something unusual in architecture, because who would bother? There are fake buildings, like this example of Trompe l'oeil, but it's hard to fake a building's attribution. Typically a building's history is well documented and stands indubitably in a specific place and either intersects or not with an architect's biography. Except in Alt Baltimore, or an imaginary place like it. And here, the building and the architect's life exist really only by virtue of a consensual illusion. Here, architectural pseudepigrapha makes sense. In Alt Baltimore, dead architects and their clients can be brought back to life, or better yet, a project in Alt Baltimore can capture the zeitgeist of real Baltimore and even improve it. For instance, what does this big letter P stand for? Well, in this design, P is for poet. It was just about 1 year ago that Morgan's President Wilson offered Amanda Gorman a position as poet in residence. That was exciting. Don't you remember? I thought it was going to happen. Wilson said at the time, quote, "I'm very serious about opening an opportunity for her to come as a poet in residence. We have all kinds of authors on campus, and we think that being at Morgan for a year would give her an even deeper and wider perspective on the issues she's addressing," unquote. But where would she live? Where would she live? There's no house or apartment on Morgan's campus, and I kind of don't think she's going to live in a dorm. Well, I think she would live here. Back in 2010, Alt Baltimore built the Poets House, a neighborhood center for the spoken word. It's in Reservoir Hill, and that's kind of a cross-town commute for Morgan, but it's not that far. After Amanda Gorman spends her day in her Holmes Hall office, she can return home to enjoy the following amenities in the evening: a ground floor event space, including book sales and cafe, a roof terrace for receptions and other events, and an upper floor apartment for her featuring an open air pulpit for new public readings. You can see that on the left. Here she is sharing a new work with the community. I mean, who wouldn't want to go down to Reservoir Hill to catch Ms. Gorman's midnight readings, even on a cold February night? After her stint at Morgan is over, the apartment would be available for other eligible poets. You can invite one of your own. Now, for what it's worth, this project was ostensibly designed by Phil Freeland after he sold his practice to Perkins and Will. In the Alt Baltimore universe, Freeland is still alive. He jumped ship from his corporate position, and now he works solo from his storefront office in Raleigh, North Carolina, where he also dabbles in ceramics. I really want Baltimore to have a poet's house. All right. So, if I take a step back and begin to speculate about the source of some of these ideas, I find myself especially attracted to themes that address the relationship between art and architecture, or more specifically, the praxis of art making, how art gets made. I consider architecture to be an art, at least in its best instances. And so some of these Alt Baltimore projects critique our expectations about how we commission architecture. But architecture also surrounds art and provides an armature for its display and a space for its consumption. And as we all know, there's a lot that's pretty wacky about the art world. So the following project really just jumps right into that mire. Do you remember the debates about legalized gambling in Maryland about 10 years ago, 12 years ago? You may not remember then that there was a proposition that nonprofits too should benefit from the revenue by now legal slot machines. So in the Alt Baltimore universe, the first in line were the museums and institutions like that, like the venerable Walters Art Gallery. The Walters lead curator argued at the time that the gallery's art collection was its greatest resource. So why not up the ante on art? Well, what you see here is the direct result of that, the Walters Art Casino. Housed in a renovated Mount Vernon vertical car park on the southwest corner of Cathedral and Center Streets, the Walters Art Casino attracts gamblers from all around Maryland with a chance to win genuine copies of Visigothic jewelry, Roman ossuary, Coptic sarcophagi, and Barrier bronzes. Baltimoreans my age may recall the Lotto slogan from the 70s, "You gotta play to win." And that is nowhere more true than at the Walters Art Casino. To facilitate the flow of certified fakes into lucky visitors' hands, the building also includes artists' workshops immediately above the gambling floors. The Walters offers year-long fellowships to qualified and talented young artists from around the world. They're very prestigious, these fellowships. And those who are successfully awarded the fellowships then come to Baltimore and transform raw materials into replicas of items in the museum's collections. And in return, they're provided room, board, and the chance to exercise once a week. Now, the fellows may not be allowed to leave the facility during their indenture, but they nonetheless have terrific views from their live-work studios. And each studio is equipped with a sink, an electric kettle, and a working commode. Many of the fellows have even complimented the quality of the studio's hemp futons. Now you can see on the right, inside one of the studios, and the artist is discussing her work with visitors from New York, one of whom brought sandwiches to supplement the artist's daily ration of yogurt and granola. Now, of course, nothing says fun like morning drinking, so casino guests are especially welcome at the Art Casino's rooftop lounge, which is open around the clock. And there they can enjoy the Baltimore skyline while sipping their favorite cocktail served in replicas of 18th century Murano goblets. Although these can be purchased from the Walters online stores, visitors are also encouraged to try their luck on the one-eyed bandits down below, since what says art better than dropping serious coin and taking a chance? In the lower two slides, you can see gamblers at work, and these slot machines take either house tokens or Susan B. Anthony dollar coins, just like Baltimore's local metro. Now remember, in the art world, you got to play to win. Now, to be honest, out of all the designs I'm showing you today, I think that one has the best chance of getting built. And that's because even the designs I proposed that were not meant to be satiric end up being jokes, if you think about how things are run in the United States. For instance, this project was supposed to be a subsidized housing for postal workers. Now, many countries around the world, they provide accommodations like this. And in a city like Paris, these apartments are almost always at the vanguard of architectural design. So I thought, why not in Baltimore? Of course, having witnessed the dismantling of the US postal system under Postmaster Louis DeJoy, and having witnessed the crazy animosity of patrons of the post office towards the understaffed workers there, and perceiving, of course, the future of robot package delivery, I had to reconceive this project as a far future post-apocalyptic secure refuge for former postal workers, their descendants, and the DNA of extinct plant species. It does have a nice cafe at the bottom, so there's that. Now, another project came about with the input of my CRGA colleagues, since the medical office building typology is a staple of the firm's practice. We usually refer to these as MOBs, medical office buildings, and this project was conceived to address two issues which at first might seem unconnected, the COVID pandemic and the urban dimension of medical facilities development. So if you've ever been to an MOB, you've probably been there out somewhere in the suburbs. You probably drove there. You probably parked in a huge surface lot or an enormous garage, and you found your way to your medical appointment by way of a generic lobby, some generic corridors, and a nondescript reception room. In all Baltimore, however, these MOBs are situated right in your own neighborhood within walking distance. And in fact, they function more like community social centers like private office buildings. This design offers walk-in testing at the ground floor, health education and pharmacy facilities upstairs, and even a full-fledged yoga and childcare facility right above that. There are the usual medical offices in the upper levels, but at the top is an event space that can host public and private catered affairs. Would you book your wedding at the neighborhood MOB Sky Lounge? I know I would. Now, it turns out that in this case, real life is already anticipated all Baltimore. Healthcare systems around the country are already positioning their MOBs as cultural and commercial centers in a very similar way. Their enterprise branding for these buildings includes social and commercial environments, just like Starbucks. And they even specify the kinds of smells and aromas that are deployed throughout the building. So much for satire. A design like this one hasn't even begun to illustrate the weird ways in which our lives are now changing almost every day. But there is one thing, in Baltimore, architects very seriously the challenge of integrating public art with their clients' promotional needs. Healthcare architects often make use of environmental graphics to set a mood or to foster serenity. And as I just mentioned, environmental graphics are a key part of many healthcare systems' corporate branding. But this project goes beyond that just a little. And that's because in healthcare, it's a fight out there. It's a fight it's a cultural battle for attention, for authority, and for belief. Accordingly, this design includes billboard-sized supergraphics as in a pragmatic nod to healthcare's need to promote and to advocate and to attract. I mean, this kind of advertising worked for old cigarettes, and it works for new iPhones. So why not for our individual and public health also? Now, there were similar questions behind this project, which were proposed as a public sanatorium and flexible transient housing for times at which the pandemic kind of ebbs and waxes. Do you guys remember 2020, just a couple of years ago, when the city had to take over the convention center as a ward for COVID patients? No doubt we could have done better, and we may have to do better in the future if we are subjected to repeated waves of new infectious diseases. In all Baltimore, of course, Mayor Elizabeth Gilman's administration addressed public health right away, and built this Ministry of Health in 1938. It is located near the Inner Harbor, overlooking the water. And when tuberculosis and smallpox, waxed throughout the city's at-risk populations, they could find temporary lodgings here. Each bank of rooms had easy access to exterior open space, and even each room could be open to fresh air. Mayor Gilman had some trouble finding an architect for this project. American architects were slightly risk averse and were hesitant to take on a commission that was so utopian. At least that's what they told her. So Gilman, found architects elsewhere who were not so timid. Yakov Chernikov, who moved from Leningrad to Baltimore to oversee this project. Of course, at the time, the Soviets were only too glad to get rid of Chernikov, whose constructivist designs, like you see in the upper right, were no longer in Stalin's favor. But afterwards, the building served as the prototype for all similar buildings throughout the United States, as you can see on the lower right. Well, I'm going to wrap something up with a very different example, and one that somewhat cuts close to the reality of our non-alt American city. As Rust Belt's cities in the United States, like Baltimore, Detroit, Trenton, as they demolish more and more of their core housing stock, the trend is towards decreasing density, and the subsequent suburbanization of formerly urban areas is one of the results. Now, this is not fake news. More and more of Baltimore's architectural core has been eradicated for both good and bad reasons. The photo in the lower left is a block clearance in progress. The torn down buildings are usually long abandoned, they stand empty, and we all know that recent research correlates house vacancy with the problems that famously characterize our neighborhoods. Now, in the real Baltimore, the solution is to tear down those houses and replant the result with grass, or what is worse to my mind, to rebuild what's there, but following suburban models for aspirational home buyers. So, I have to ask, whose aspirations are we really building for? And that's where the project at the upper right comes in. Because among the casualties of this trend are the animals that have adapted to human crowding, to hardscape, to the ecology created by decayed buildings. In a remade landscape of new grassy lawns and wide driveways and 3-bedroom plus garage homes, what is left for pigeons, starlings, and sparrows? Those animals, they need a place for themselves. The urban bird sanctuary, therefore, has been designed as a complete environment for the citified bird. Rough concrete walls, broken windows, and ad hoc foliage contribute to an exciting new kind of place to be for people as well as for pigeons. At-grade commercial spaces provide amenities for the humans, while their inevitable detritus provides nourishment for the city cliff dwellers above. Urban bird sanctuary is nothing if not innovative. Now, in Baltimore, for instance, no longer needs an architect stamp to permit a project like this. A design like this can be crowdsourced on Minecraft with contributions from 10-year-olds at local elementary schools. And under new legislation, professional liability will devolve upon the kids' parents if anything goes wrong with the building for the next 25 years. Now, that's, as an architect, I say better than me. I kind of think this could work. I think this is progress. No doubt the moneyed classes of Baltimore's exurbs would be thrilled to have this urban destination with or without valet parking. Everybody loves bird watching, and the market on bird guano is perpetually bullish. The way things are going, I think that bird shit might be the next NFT. So why not invest in this exciting value proposition right now? Well, thank you very much for your patience. All right, we have plenty of time. Maybe another 15 minutes. If anybody does have some comments or questions, I'd love to hear from you.
That was hysterical. Thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, we'll open it up for questions from the audience, comments. That was definitely needed on a cold day.
Who's moving to Alt Baltimore? I'm already living there. Okay, 1, 2. Okay. All right. Was there a particular project that anybody found interesting from a historical perspective, not necessarily an architectural perspective? Well, I'll tell you what, I'll prompt you by sharing that one of the historical figures that I mentioned that I found interesting to learn about was Elizabeth Gilman, who's real. You know, she was the socialist candidate for governor and for mayor in the 1920s and 30s. And she is related to that Gilman, the famous Daniel Coit Gilman, who was president of Hopkins. And I think, was he later at Berkeley, who was president?
He was
maybe
originally at Berkeley.
Originally at Berkeley and came
He was
east.
at Yale and then Berkeley.
Yeah.
And he was the first president of the University of California.
Right. So, you know, she comes from a very interesting family pedigree, but she became interested in socialist politics in the 1910s and was quite prominent. In real Baltimore, she had a little less success than what she had in alt Baltimore. But I kind of can't help but wonder if, you know, things could have been differently at, you know, in the 1930s when, you know, the labor movement was at its height and things were tough. So, you know, it could have been different.
Jeremy, that was fabulous. Really entertaining and provocative. A real take on what could have been or could be. And I was thinking about this last example, the deurbanization of the city. It's this. I don't think actually leaders see it as the same kind of problem that you and I and many in the room do, but in a way, what you're proposing is actually quite realistic, right? We've got these public art engagement projects across the Rust Belt, doing things in vacant space. We've got this great appreciation for the renaturalization or re-ruralization of the landscape. And I'm just thinking this is something we should run with, right? And you even got the retail there, right? So there's something in it for humans too, besides those who just want to go and check out the birds. You can get a coffee or you drop off your dry cleaning.
And of course, there's nothing innovative about the typology. It's the podium building, you know, retail at the bottom, arbitrary number of floors above. But the occupants may not be, income generating unless unless we do expand our notion of what an NFT is. I think, I will say this one thing that, you know, every week we're reading about another example of this. I mean, Hopkins tearing down those row houses opposite from Wyman Park Dell. I mean, they're not great pieces of architecture, but evidently the plan is to leave them fallow, leave the ground fallow. So, you know, how does that help any environment to leave, you know, to take down their bulk and replace it with, you know, with nothing, essentially?
Agreed. And many cities, including Baltimore, it's worse, I think, in Detroit and Cleveland and some of the smaller cities of the Rust Belt. I think they're myopic in how they view these houses, right? And one day when there's nothing urban about this landscape, and not only nothing urban, but nothing that is distinctive to their regions or their history or their culture, they'll be sorry, or collectively will be sorry. And I worry about that in Baltimore, seeing the example that you've stated, and
well, if we build
demolitions
this
on the west side.
Yeah, if we build this, at least we're going to get their birds. At least we'll have their birds. So that's a plus.
The birds.
Jeremy, it's so good to see you here. It just reminded us how much we miss you at Morgan. I know that we are supposed to stay away from our emotions. And also, it's so great to see other Kargons here. So it's a very good opportunity. So When you were presenting the last project, and you did not talk much about this last project, I was actually thinking about the pigeon towers in
Yes.
the Middle East, right?
Mhm.
And then I was also kind of thinking about my conversation with Kishu Kurokawa 20 years ago in his office in Kyoto when I was having an interview with him, because you know that he wrote this book that was, entitled Symbiosis with Nature, right? And of course, everyone has been talking about symbiosis with nature, right? But he had some interesting ideas when not many people were talking about that. And then I was kind of comparing this project to what you see in the Middle East, especially in Iran. And interestingly, some of these pigeon towers were not necessarily located in rural areas. Some of them
They were
were
urban, of
close
course.
to urban areas. So mainly designed to help the agriculture. But to a large extent, there were places for relaxation for some people. So they went there. So it's quite interesting that there are just so many kind of parallels with history that we can see here. So what's your opinion here?
I'm very conscious to the precedent of columbariums, in the Middle East, where I knew a few of them. I know in Israel, some of them are built below ground, but they're the only actual beautiful, large scale spaces that exist from the ancient world in that area. That is, we're talking, 2,000, 2,100 years ago, built underground. But another idea came to mind actually was, J.B. Jackson writes a lot about, he has an article, right? It's the necessity of ruins and the evocation that coexisting with projects not only of age but of some kind of abandonment that allows one's imagination to sort of to skip over to something new and different in the future. And I think that's the other way I saw this is we're building a new ruin because we've eradicated our old ones. Not that anybody deserves to live on a block with many abandoned buildings, but at least if we can retain some trace of our history through abandonment towards reuse, I think we'd be better off. So. All right. I see a lot of faces I haven't seen in a while too, that go back 20, 30 years. I want to say hello to Ben and Chris, and Anne is also here. Well, it's good to see you guys. It's been a while. And Matthew, of course, goes back longer than anybody. He made it in.
Hi, Jeremy. Good to see you. And
Samia.
thank you for a great presentation. I love this last project.
Oh, do you? Okay. It's for the birds.
I think I'm wondering also if this project is also capturing water.
It absolutely is. Yes,
Exactly.
that's a bird bath on top. And I want to thank digital technology to make it as photogenic as it is in this rendering. But sure, the birds, birds need a place to drink, and they also need a place to use water to foul. I mean, they're like humans. If they have a beautiful river, we'll dump some toxic waste in it, and birds are no different. So
and they also like human,
Yes.
what humans eat. So have you considered having some kind of food production along with allowing the birds? Trees, berry trees, they love berries.
All that produce is sold here at Urban Bird Cafe.
Okay.
Yes, it's already underway.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. Great to see you, Jeremy.
Yes, thank you.
We do miss you.
Thank you. Now, a project like this is a project that I've always fantasized because I've always been too inhibited as a designer to go there, right? I mean, this, as you can see, this was an image from the bad old 70s, where, around the world, architects who didn't know any better, hadn't read Christopher Alexander, were, building big things like that. And I've always wanted to be those people. I mean, my role model was John Portman, and I couldn't share that with my colleagues or my fellow students in graduate school. So I had to keep it, down below my skin, but finally it's out. Okay. So it's out, and I'm using, my new digital skills to visualize as much of it as I can before I run out. So But I'll say this, I think this is definitely a project that I think city leaders are going to have to consider. We need a place for future epidemics, and it needs to be flexible in the sense that we can't, it may be empty half the year, maybe empty for 5 years at a time, but during those fallow times when the virus has receded, we can certainly put it to good use, whether for transient housing or for market rate housing for that matter. But I would like to see something like this. Also a building with a lot of air in it, not so solid as so many American buildings are. So this was a lot of fun to sketch up.
Jeremy, hey, I just wanted to chime in and say,
right.
So fantastic.
Okay.
It was really great to see and to see you, but the whole thing was very just freeing the mind. I really, took a flight of imagination with you, and that's one of the most valuable things of this kind of exploration.
Well, thanks for that. Now, Ben was a colleague of mine in graduate school, and he may or may not remember that I was incredibly inhibited as a designer. For years and years, unless I was given a site, unless I was given a project and a program, I couldn't let the imagination out because I felt it was a waste of time, irrelevant or whatever. And that's what, now I'm 57 years old. I don't have that inhibition anymore. I'm done with reality.
Very good. Your imagination is flowing.
Well, this was one of the reasons I approached the lecture organizers at Morgan, because I think it's always a useful example for students who are being told always that you have it so good now, you have complete freedom now, do with what you can. They need to understand that there is, there's some truth to that, and that they should relax and not always worry about what Professor Kargon or Professor Garapur or Professor Kirshner are saying in design studio. Follow one's muse, and my muse in this case was a disease, but nevertheless it was inspiring.
Yeah.
Jeremy, that last facility also, I see something real about it, and that kind of facility could be open when there's no epidemic. It could be rented out to community groups, right, or left open for itinerant use. It could be that bar mitzvahs, right? Like
you're referring to the MOB or
corporate retreats. I see
this one or the other one?
Sanatorium.
the sanatorium.
Well, I think that this is housing. This is so. And I know I would definitely have my my bar mitzvah up on that thing there, but more than that, it really need like other projects of its ilk. I mean, you've all seen Escher's endless staircase, right? I think that's a phenomenon that we have too little of in American urban environments. The idea that you can walk on top of the building and that the landscape continues to deflect and move up. This is Fred Sharman, who I think is somewhere online, has talked about new ground. So here's my new ground in Baltimore. Presumably that these escalators are open 24/7 to the public and are accessible from the ground. And it's only during time of pandemic that some of those levels are shut off. So it's shut off from the top down, it could be still new ground from the bottom up. And where they meet into the middle is an interesting interface. And I don't know how to design that particularly. All right. Tell you what, it's I think I'll let everybody get back to their lunch, but maybe a couple more questions if anybody has one.
Hey, Jeremy, I love hearing you and seeing the project. I think you use beautifully the technology and your imagination. And somehow I was reminded of a book I read very long ago by Italo Calvino, Invisible Cities, when you mentioned reality. And maybe my question would be, which other cities are you going to design for like this to make other alt cities? Because probably many would need that.
I think Calvino's book is the most famous book about architecture that I've never read, unfortunately. But of course I know all the the taglines from it. Of course, really reality. But for now I'm sticking to Baltimore because Baltimore needs me. I'm planning a trip to the United Kingdom for May, and I'm looking at cities in England that I've never visited. A place like Bristol, and all I know about Bristol, it's in the West Country, support. It's got to be the armpit of England, and I'm looking at the street views. It has gotten so much better than so many American cities just in the last 20 years because they're investing in infrastructure. They have transit, and this is in a country which is almost as laissez-faire as the United States. But it just goes to show that places around the world are leaving us behind because they value their cities. So again, I'm not sure any place else needs all Baltimore except for real Baltimore. All right, last question. Oh, Dan, you're muted.
Okay, if nobody else has another question, I just, maybe you could talk just a moment or two about your own evolution with the technology and how
Okay,
you created this. How did you master these things that you
Okay,
the
I do have an
software
interesting
package that you did it?
I do have an interesting answer to that, because one of the reasons I left Morgan was that in spring of 2020, when we all went online to teach our classes, including Studio, and I was no longer able to sit with a tracing paper and kind of sketch out things for students, I was faced with communicating to students, not just verbally, but I had to communicate graphically. And, my only graphics was digital, right? And at the time, of course, I didn't know Revit. I didn't have any of the, the visualization software. And so I was faced with a conundrum. I had to draw everything up in AutoCAD if I just wanted to express a simple idea. And of course, I didn't stop. I would take a student's project, I would draw it all up, I would design the whole damn thing, and I kind of felt frustrated. God, this is much better than if I left it to the student. Gee, this, I'm enjoying this. And so I realized I very much wanted to get back to having my own skills and my own activities, which being design based. So, I picked up Revit. There are tutorials online that everybody has access to, and our students are, I recommended them to my students. At my new place of work, CRGA, they use Enscape, which is a visual plugin, a visualization plugin for, and it makes these things come out very easily. It's not very complicated. So each of these projects was simply another way of testing a new skill. So that's another reason to be imaginative, is just that I have to become professionally competent. So this was one way of doing that. But I think one thing that these images do not provide is a discourse about architectural visualization. In a way, I'm very much a product of my own era, which is, the 1970s and 80s, where, architects were focused on buildings, not so much ideas, but about, and the result of the design was an object, not a design about not a diagram about a concept. So I found myself kind of at a loss when teaching, trying to emphasize diagramming skills and visualization skills that weren't so focused on reality. So that's where I would like to take this next. I mean, I think that in a discourse about history, there has to also be a discourse about the history and unfolding of architectural representation. The very first image I worked with here, the Cariani piece, you can see I'm looking at, it's black and white, it's showing a worm's eye view. This is at least one step towards trying to understand how these historical figures represented their architecture. And I don't think any of the other projects do that. They're just sort of, trying to make things look either like, this doesn't look very realistic to me. Some of these do. And of course, evening shots are always, sexy for almost anybody. Let me try and find that's a beautiful shot, by anybody's, standards, or at least by my own. But I think the next step is to really push, new forms of graphics as a way of sharing not just content, but also ideas. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, listen, I want to thank everybody again who's been here, who stopped by to say hello, and please be in touch on social media or by email. Have a nice day.
Thanks a million. That was really fabulous, so inspiring, and I think we all have a lot to process and think about, and just great to see you. And you and I should get coffee soon.
Very good. Okay, talk to you later then.
Hey, Jeremy.
Yes.
Hey, Jeremy. This is
Yeah.
Todd from the office.
Yeah.
I joined late. I enjoyed this, but I joined late because I had another meeting, so I missed like the first 7-8 minutes of the presentation. I know it was recorded. Are you going to send out a link that so I can catch up on what you?
Well, when Morgan shares the link, I will then share it with you. No problem.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, man. I appreciate it. I enjoyed
Very
this.
good. Okay, guys. Well, listen, have a great afternoon.
You too. Thanks, Jeremy. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.